without further ado, I want to introduce our closing keynote speaker. You could easily say that he has recently joined us from the dark side. That would be a nice way of putting it. So without further ado, Shawn.
Thank you. You guys hear me okay? Volume good? All right, great. So first of all, thank you for having me out to Denmark. I've been to Denmark probably 5 or 6 times, which I always enjoy coming back here, and I appreciate you guys giving me the opportunity to come speak to you about end-user computing. How many people in this room have something to do with end-user computing? Okay, cool. So I'm not speaking to an entirely data center crew that's like, who cares about VDI and terminal services and all that kind of stuff. So what I want to kind of talk about is the state of the industry as it pertains to end-user computing. So I'm not going to talk about data center things. I'm not going to talk about the new whiz-bang hyper-converged infrastructure and all these kind of things. I want to talk more specifically about what is happening to applications and Windows desktops as we know it, and where are things headed in the future. So really quickly, I want to give you a little bit of background on myself just so you guys know what my perspective is. So if I say certain things, that you'll at least understand what my background is and why I might have come up with those assumptions about how things work. So I spent 20 years in consulting. I ran my own consulting practice for about 18 or 19 of those years that I was in consulting. Majority of my experience has been large enterprise, so 5,000 plus seats. I did have some small, medium customers, but probably 90-95% of all the customers I work with were large enterprise. From an industry perspective, I did a lot of financial services. I did some government, education, so it kind of spread a lot of different industries, but a majority of it was financial services, insurance, banking, those types of things. Focused mostly on the Citrix Microsoft stack. So the joke that was made about joining from the dark side is absolutely true. I spent a very long amount of time being involved in the Citrix and Microsoft community. And I was formerly, I say formerly because I had to hang up both of these awards when I joined VMware, but I was a Citrix CTP for 8 years and a Microsoft MVP on RDS for 6 years. And those are awards that are given by Citrix and Microsoft for people who they view are influential in the industry, that are sharing information with people. And I was doing a lot of conference presentations and training classes and those types of things. So I was lucky enough to receive those awards, which in theory would provide me with inside information about the roadmap and planning that Citrix and Microsoft were doing. I say in theory because Microsoft got a little weird about this right around the time Windows 8 came out, and they sort of stopped sharing information with MVPs, which was kind of a weird thing because we were meeting to discuss roadmap and planning, and then they just kind of stopped sharing roadmap and planning. So it was like, great, so I just flew out to Seattle to spend 3 days with a bunch of my Microsoft friends and learned absolutely nothing. But they're getting a bit better. They're starting to open up some more. But bottom line is Microsoft went through a difficult transition there with mobility and Apple becoming a big competitor and Google and these kind of things. So they've morphed a bit over the years. I've been working for VMware now for just under 2 months. So to put things in perspective, I have not yet been fully assimilated into the VMware culture. Now, let me give some background on what I mean by that. I have been doing, from a data center perspective, I've been doing all implementations of Microsoft Citrix technology have always been on top of vSphere because from a hypervisor perspective, Zen Server is a complete joke. It's an abomination. I've said that like since it was first acquired by Citrix. Hyper-V, a lot of customers have interest in it, but the interest sort of wanes as time goes on because a lot of the features aren't quite there to match on the VMware data center side. Now, because I work for VMware now, you could probably say, oh, well, you're biased, and that I guess that's probably true to a certain degree, but I've been working with them for 2 months, so I don't think I've got a lot of bias at this stage. My official title at VMware is I am the Senior Director of Strategy and Planning over end-user computing desktop products. Now, I want to bring up specifically that I'm speaking about desktop products here because I don't have any responsibility over the mobile products. So VMware acquired AirWatch in the last year, as you guys know, and AirWatch is something that's completely outside of my area of responsibility. My job purpose is to focus on longer-term strategy, and I specifically say longer-term because we already have a product management organization that is focused on what we're going to be doing over the next 0 to 18 months. So they're already leading that charge. My job is to figure out what we need to do in the 18-month to 3-year time frame in order to keep a competitive edge, or in some cases, catch up with our competitors. So I'm focused on the desktop products. So View, Horizon DAS, Workspace, Flex, Mirage, App Volumes, all of those types of products fall under my responsibility. And of course, VMware on the product side is a large organization. I'm not the guy that makes the decisions on all these things. We have a fairly large product team, but I'm kind of one of the people who is responsible at setting our future strategy and direction. So, for an agenda, I want to talk about a couple of things. The first of which is Windows is dead. Why are you wasting time on Windows? And this is not what you might think. I'm actually in the complete opposite opinion of what most people believe with respect to Windows. So we'll talk about that for a bit. Talk a little bit about everyone talking about mobility and how mobility is eating everything, and why do you worry about desktop compute and what's the purpose of those things when you should be focusing on mobility on tablets and smartphones. And then I want to talk a little bit on kind of what's on the horizon, and I use this pun intended here. What I mean is, what are things that I find compelling or interesting, not necessarily things that VMware is going to invest in, but if I was allowed to choose things where we should be investing time and money, I want to talk about a couple key technology areas that I think are very important for the future. So the first thing I want to talk about is the death toll of Windows has been greatly exaggerated, okay? Most of the people in this room are probably using a Windows laptop. Some of you might have Macs, some of you might be Linux advocates, whatever the case may be, but by and large, a majority of us are probably using Windows laptops. And the reason why I want to talk about this topic is because in the industry, there has been a lot of commentary in the last couple of years about Windows dying. So way back to 2007, there was this article by Jeff Atwood that said, "Who killed the desktop app?" And this is years ago that this momentum started, that the desktop apps were going to go away and be replaced with web applications. And so desktop applications are dying, 5 web apps that replace your desktop's apps, don't bet against the open web. VMware's Paul Maritz, when he was leading VMware, put an article out that basically said Windows is dead. Brian Madden put an interesting article out that said the future of Windows in the enterprise is middleware. And this was in 2013. Now, there are people that believe this is true, but they apparently haven't spent enough time focusing on the history of computing to understand exactly how long that kind of transition takes. So let me remind you guys a brief history of the internet, which started in 1969 when the very first ARPANET node got brought online. ARPANET was the U.S. DARPA organization that created a communications network originally intended for university PCs and those types of things, and government military as well. So 1981 was really the first leap that brought about the change from the old-style mainframe and mini into the modern PC world, and that was the personal computer in 1981. 83, we got DNS. In 1986, there were 5,000 hosts on ARPANET, which is the predecessor to the modern internet. 1990, ARPANET ended, and officially the internet was born, and Tim Berners-Lee creates the World Wide Web architecture. Now, just to be very clear, Tim Berners-Lee and DARPA is who actually created the internet. It was not the Vice President of the United States, just to be very clear about that. 1993, Mosaic web browser got created, and then Netscape Communications was founded in 94. Now, this is a lot of historical drivel that's not really that important to modern compute, but here's where things get interesting. In 1995, people started making predictions that desktop operating systems and apps were going to be replaced by the web. This is 1995. How many people in this room were doing computing in 1995? Awesome. So a lot of people have been in this for a long time. I've been involved in computers since the very, very early days, and I remember the beginnings of the internet. I used to run a bulletin board for many years. Not exactly legal activity back in those days, but I digress. 1996, prediction of desktop apps being replaced by the web. Same thing in 1997. 2006, prediction of desktop apps and OS being replaced by the web. Still, in 2006, we're making the same claim that we were over 10 years ago, and yet it never quite happened. In 2007 was the rise of the smartphone. Now, 2007 was definitely not the very first smartphone by any stretch, but it was the very first smartphone that got wide consumer adoption. Does everyone know what phone was released in 2007? Apple's iPhone? Now, you can love or hate Apple, and I'm not trying to be a fanboy of Apple here, but that device changed the smartphone industry without question. Every phone manufactured before 2007 looked like a mobile phone made before 2007. Every phone made after 2007 looked like an iPhone. And you can't discredit that. They all literally shifted as of 2007. So it was a big, big change. 2008, we had predictions about how desktop apps and OS were going to be replaced by mobile apps. And you're like, you got to be kidding me. We just spent the last 10 years debating that the web was going to replace desktop apps and OS. And now we're talking about the mobile app is going to replace it. Now, the mobile app, in fairness, is an extension of the web, right? A mobile app is some native code that more than likely consumes web services behind the scenes. But at the end of the day, it's still people arguing around the same thing of Windows apps and the Windows desktop are dead. And I don't believe that's true, at least not in the short term, and probably not for the long term. So we keep having this conversation ad nauseum. And it's been over 15 years since the explosion of the web, and there's still a lot of Windows apps. Why is this the case? I'll get into that in just a second. Let's talk about what web technologies have been created over the years. We have Flash, we have .NET, Cold Fusion, Java, jQuery, Perl, Ruby, Ajax, Adobe Air, you name it. The number of web technologies that have been developed has created this ecosystem where there is no standard web development language. Now, today you could argue that Ruby and Python and JavaScript are leading or dominating a web development technology, which is absolutely true. But there are still just as many web platforms that have been developed in alternative languages as there were in the classic sense of Windows apps that were deviating across different development languages. So we took what we had in the Windows world for classic app development, and we recreated the exact same thing in the web. And ultimately, that means that you've got a lot of legacy that you have to do something to deal with it. So 15 years since the explosion of the web in 97, 98, and at least 15 different web development platforms in that time. And in 2014, there's still over 1 billion Windows PCs and somewhere between 4 to 8 million Windows apps. Now, why do I say somewhere between 4 to 8 million? The reason is we don't know how many Windows apps there are. There was no Windows App Store back when this stuff started in the mid-90s. The App Store didn't exist. It wasn't until Apple came up with the App Store as part of iTunes that really drove the notion of software delivery via a store service like that. So the estimate of how many Windows apps that exist comes from Microsoft. It is a best guess. Nobody knows for sure how many exist. And why is it so hard to figure out? Because Microsoft, probably their greatest strength and their greatest weakness, was giving away their SDKs to practically anybody who wanted to create software. So as a result, anybody could be a software developer, which created some very horrible applications out there. But the problem is we have no real understanding of how many true Windows apps there are. But it's somewhere between 4 to 8 million apps. Windows still controls 92% of the global PC market share. This is according to some data I collected from February 2013. So 92% of the worldwide PCs still run Windows. Now, of course, that's shifting and it's changing over time. So what I say is that, after nuclear war, it's going to be Windows apps and cockroaches. I originally had Twinkies up here, but then there's some risk that the Twinkie factory was going to get shut down. And I don't know, is Twinkies even popular here? Do you guys have Twinkies? No? Okay, so these are little horrible sponge cakes that are supposed to be like a snack, but they're horrible for you. But anyway, Twinkies last like 30 years. These things just never end up going bad. So my point is that after nuclear war, we're going to have Windows apps and cockroaches and probably Twinkies as well. So why did we start going down this path of saying that Windows is doomed and desktop compute as we know it is going away? Well, there's been people who have been publishing some research that looks sort of like this. So this is data from Asimco. And what the data shows is that from the 80s through 2004, there used to be a ratio of PCs to Macs sold that was about 56 to 1. So in the heyday of Windows, we had 56 PCs sold for every Mac that was sold. And I'm picking on Mac here because there's some interesting data here that I'll get to in just a second. But it was 56 times the number of PCs sold than Macs. Then the decline began in 2004 through about 2010, where now we're only at about 18 to 20, probably about 20 times the number of PCs sold versus Mac. And this trend continues as time goes on. But there's an interesting data point. If you add in the iPad and iPhone devices, the numbers become even more staggering. Now it's down to the fact of about 2 to 1 PCs that are sold versus the number of phones and tablets. And this is going out through 2010. This has gone even further in decline since 2010. Now, somebody would say to me, well, it's not fair that you're comparing smartphone and tablet purchases against the PC because it's a whole different form factor. So you need to include Surface tablets and Windows Phone and whatever. The reality is the numbers don't change that significantly. And I'm not trying to be negative on Microsoft. I'm just saying that iOS and Android are dominating the tablet and smartphone industry. And so these numbers are really not that significantly different when you factor in the Surface and the Windows Phone. In addition, think about what's happened to the OS landscape over time. This is from Kleiner Perkins. If you look at what happened from the early 70s all the way through the very most recent years, and this data only goes up through 2011, 2012, look at what's happened from the traditional Wintel enterprise to what Android and Apple are doing. Now, Apple, of course, iOS is a huge part of this, not just OS X. But think of what's happening in terms of devices used, and these numbers continue to trend upward near 2014. But it's at a point now where 80% or 90% of the devices in use are tablets or smartphones running Android or iOS. They are displacing the common PC. Now, I want to talk specifically about what the total number of global devices are to put things in perspective. So I mentioned that we have 1 billion Windows PCs. And from an iOS perspective, this data is from March 2013. I don't have absolute current data, but I can give you rough approximations. But in 2013, there were about 500 million iOS devices and about 750 million Android devices. So they've almost caught up from a device count perspective. In 2014, I can give you approximate numbers. iOS is around 800 million now, so it's almost caught up to the number of Windows PCs. And Android is about 1.5 billion devices. So Android has already eclipsed the number of Windows PCs. And think about the time frame in which this happened. The Windows world has happened over the last 20 to 30 years. Now, of course, PCs roll over and get thrown away and that kind of stuff. But the number of Windows PCs has been evolving over the last 20 years. These devices have basically been since 2007 and onward. So in 7 years' time, these things have caught up to what the Windows ecosystem has done over the last 20 to 30 years. That's pretty impressive when you think about it. But the more important thing is that mobile traffic is dominating the internet at a very, very increasing rate. So this data is from 2012, so it's not absolutely the most current. But 10% of global internet traffic is now being conducted from mobile devices. And you can see this trend line is continuing. We're probably at 15+% now, which means more people are getting their work done on tablets and smartphones than ever before. That's not to say they're not using desktop PCs. It's just that the trend is rising, that they're starting to use mobile devices more and more to get the same amount of work done. Most importantly, if you focus on non-established companies that don't have a rich amount of disposable income, so think about the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. These have huge populations that don't have the same disposable income that most of us in the more westernized world have at our disposal. So these people don't have the money to purchase a PC. They don't have one at home. All they have is a smartphone. That is their entire compute device, is their smartphone. In countries like that, here's an example of India. The mobile internet traffic has actually eclipsed desktop internet traffic in that country. That's mind-boggling if you think about it. So while I said Windows apps and the Windows ecosystem are not going anywhere anytime soon, the trend is clearly indicating that mobile is where things are at. Mobile is where it's headed for a lot of people in a lot of places. Now, here's where things get interesting. The estimated number of apps per platform, and this data is from March 2013. Like I said before, 4 to 8 million Windows apps. That's the best approximation we have. In the iOS and Android ecosystem side, and again, this data is from March 2013, we had around 1 million applications in those two ecosystems. Now, it's not to say that these guys have done horribly because, look at how many Windows has and look at how few they have. These guys have only been at it for like 7 years, and they've already created about 25 to 12% the total number of apps that existed in Windows. Now, to play devil's advocate, I could say, well, there's like 42 versions of a fart application in their app store, and who cares about that? It's completely irrelevant to business. That's absolutely true. There is still a ton of business being conducted here that is not happening here. This is definitely more consumer-oriented. But the shift to use these consumer devices for business purposes is on the rise, which means more and more serious app developers from this side over here are porting their stuff to these platforms. So this trend will continue to rise over time. So mobility is the new focus we all have to be concerned about. I'm not suggesting you tell your organization we should scrap all of our Windows stuff and develop for the web and develop for mobile. I'm definitely not suggesting that. It's going to take a very, very long time for us to get to a point where a mobile device is the sole productivity device for all of us. But the trend is definitely happening. So you do have to have some kind of enterprise mobility management strategy. Of course, VMware would like that to be AirWatch, but whatever your choice is. You have a decision to make around mobile device management, mobile application management, or some mixture of both. And I'm not going to get into all the deep specifics of how MDM versus MAM differ. I will say that in general, this is a very crowded space, and it is very rapidly becoming a race to the bottom. What I mean by that is every MDM and MAM provider is now finding themselves squeezed on cost and trying to find ways to extract more value or more license conversion in a space that's already very, very crowded. So what this means is that all these providers have to continually find ways to innovate and stay ahead in an industry that is far more rapidly advancing than what the desktop compute world is. So it's a very hard game to stay in unless you invest huge amounts in R&D. So I always say if you don't have a mobility strategy today, sometimes use the KISS principle. Sometimes just email and mobile data is good enough for your users. You don't have to go crazy in developing a complete EMM strategy for some very simple use cases. Email and data is sometimes just enough. Now, plan to use terminal services or RDSH or VDI to bridge your legacy investment. Now, I'm talking about this as a bridge, not as a strategy. Nobody wants to use Windows 7 or all their Windows apps on a tablet or smartphone. The form factor is not right. And I'm not suggesting that be your strategy. What I'm suggesting is, while you're trying to figure out how to get to the new mobile world, VDI and terminal services allows you to get to a point where you become more device agnostic. And I'm not saying that this is the year of VDI and everyone's going to do 90% VDI. And everyone remember a few years back when Gartner theorized, I think it was like about 2009 timeframe, they theorized that by 2013, 60% of enterprise compute would be delivered on VDI. Does everyone remember that? They were off by a little bit, just a little. Today, it's actually in the neighborhood of about 12 to 15% of enterprise workloads are delivered on VDI. Now, there's reason for that. VDI is not always the best use case. There's certainly technical challenges in implementing VDI, and we'll talk about some of those. The real question is, what happens to Windows as we say mobile is the new, and how do we deal with our Windows investment? Well, I like to do these long tail graphs. Everyone familiar with long tail graph? You kind of think about like the number of people using an application obviously increases the cost and complexity of converting it. And then you think about, if I'm going to move these things to a web platform, like let's say my CRM system's used by thousands of people in my organization, that would make a lot of logical sense to port that to a web technology. But once I do that, congratulations, I've knocked off one application. Now, what do I do with the other hundreds or thousands of apps I have in my org? The reality is you're going to spend years porting those things over to an alternative platform. Now, some of them, you may just choose a SaaS-based offering and drop the old solution completely, but it all depends on how the app is used in your organization. Now, I want to talk about what the next 15-year debate is, because when we talked before about everyone saying that the desktops and apps are going to be replaced by the web, that conversation is not over by any stretch. There's a new version of that conversation happening, and it looks sort of like this. Mobile apps could replace websites. So think about this for a minute. The surge in the consumer space right now, of course, is app craziness. Is there an app for that? I want to get an app for that. I don't want to use websites anymore. I want to use a mobile app, or I want to use a tablet mobile app. So mobile apps could theoretically replace the modern web. And there's many more of these, death of the website, blah, blah, blah. Will mobile apps replace the mobile web? But then there's this thing called HTML5, which there are some people that believe HTML5 is going to crush native applications. I don't think that's necessarily true, because HTML5 as it exists today has far too many limitations. But in theory, as HTML5 continues to evolve and get better, it will start to challenge some of the native mobile applications that people are creating today. The biggest challenge you have with native mobile applications is you've got platform diversity today. I've got to create Java for Android. I've got to create Objective-C for iOS. And in theory, if I'm doing Windows Mobile, I've got to do some stuff with Microsoft technologies for that. But HTML5 is the promise that we no longer have to worry about device-specific capabilities. We're going to code everything to HTML5 and it will be ubiquitous across all platforms. The problem is HTML5 did not deliver on its first-gen promises for people that went down that path. Facebook, as an example, tried to do everything related to their website and mobile apps in HTML5. They spent about 18 to 24 months, a whole lot of money, and then they killed the whole project and went back to native apps. Why? Because there were limitations in HTML5 that did not allow them to do what they wanted to do. And there are countless other stories of companies that have done similar things. So, what is my advice to you today in terms of end-user computing? And I'm not going to tell you that 2015 is the year of VDI and we're going to hit 60% or 80% or whatever. What I'm saying is that there is the ability to use VDI or terminal services, and I'm a big fan of RDSH terminal services. As you guys know, VMware just added that with Horizon 6. It's a way to bridge your investment in Windows technology. I'm not suggesting that this is the thing that you should do for security reasons, because there's a lot of people in the industry that say VDI is a security play, and those people should be beaten and hung. There is nothing about VDI that makes your security any better. You're still running Windows. It still has security issues. And if you're not careful with those security issues, you will get exploited. VDI does nothing for that. And people say, oh, well, if you're going to say it's not a security solution, but at least your data is never going to leave your data center, so that's why it's more secure. Guess what? Newsflash. Your data is already all over the freaking internet. You are not keeping it secure, keeping it in a data center in VDI. It's not happening. Get over it. It's not a security play. So if it's not a security play, why should you do VDI? Why should you do terminal services? For me, for a long time, it was more about manageability. It was about trying to find ways to deliver Windows apps and desktops in a reasonably low-cost, low-complexity way. And I say low-cost in the RDSH world, not so much in the VDI world, because that's a whole different cost-complexity equation. But getting apps out to users in a manageable way. Now, the most important thing about the conversation around VDI and terminal services that's changed over the years, and this started with 2007 with the rise of the smartphone and is absolutely relevant today, is it's one of the easiest ways to become truly endpoint agnostic. It doesn't matter if you have a thin client or zero client, or if you have a tablet or smartphone, or if you have a Windows PC, or a Linux PC, or a Mac, or a Chromebook. You can run your desktop and applications from any kind of device and get a pretty decent user experience. Now, it's not for everyone. If you're someone who travels on an airplane all the time, VDI is not a good use case. And I don't care how many people from Citrix and VMware and Microsoft are tweeting, I'm tweeting from my virtual desktop at 30,000 feet. It is idiotic to use a VDI desktop or terminal services apps from an airplane. It just doesn't make any sense. There's far too much latency involved. So it's not good for those use cases, but for other use cases, it makes a lot of sense. Now, I want to give you guys 5 quick reasons why VDI and terminal services make sense today, more so than they did when this industry really started in 2007, 2008 timeframe. Number 1 is remoting protocols. The remoting protocols that existed in 2006, 2007, 2008 was predominantly the Citrix ICA HDX protocol, which was one of the only protocols out there that did a halfway decent job in WAN-based scenarios. Now, I work for VMware now, so of course, I can't talk about how good Citrix was back in the day or whatever. But at that time, they were the only protocol that did a good job on WAN connections. Now, today, things have changed. Things have gotten a lot better. And today, it doesn't really matter whether you're using HDX or PC over IP or remote FX. They're all very, very good. The other thing that's happened over the years is there has been an increasing shift to video content. And this is not just people watching YouTube. This is people doing real collaborative work within companies. So doing web conferencing and those types of things. If you look at this data, now, this is a U.S.-centric view, but 51% of U.S. internet traffic in 2010 was video content. Think about that. That's an insane amount of bandwidth and traffic. Video is not something that traditionally worked very well in VDI or terminal services use cases, but as I mentioned, in 2014, it doesn't matter whether you're using Citrix, VMware, or Microsoft. All of these protocols have evolved enough to the point where they work good enough for the user experience to be acceptable. It may not be perfect, but it's good enough to where people are okay with that. 3D graphics were always a use case that was completely outside of the scope of VDI and terminal services. And now with the NVIDIA Grid hardware, virtualizing the GPU now opens up an entirely new opportunity for delivering 3D graphics applications at scale, whether it's terminal services or VDI. VMware is bringing vGPU support to vSphere in 2015, the 2015 release, in the first half of 2015. So there will be a competitive solution from VMware available that mimics the solution that Citrix put out with Zen Server in 2013, 2014 timeframe. Unified communications, which by and large these days, the most important aspect in terms of VDI and terminal services is how you deal with voice and video. Voice and video traditionally is a very difficult thing to do in a terminal services or VDI environment. But there are different ways of doing it too. I could always run my voice or video hairpinned inside my connection. And hairpinning basically just means that my voice or video traffic is tunneled inside of my display protocol. But depending on which display protocol you use, particularly in the Citrix world, they're TCP-based. And if you have a large amount of latency or a high amount of jitter, your voice quality and video quality really goes in the gutter when you start having latency and packet loss. So hairpin is not the solution. The good news is that in 2014, all the leading unified communication solutions, so Cisco, Avaya, Microsoft Link, all of these work pretty well in a VDI and to some degree a terminal services scenario. Some vendors don't fully support their solution in terminal services like Microsoft Link, but all these solutions work pretty well in VDI and in terminal services. The reason is all these vendors have developed methods of taking the voice and video outside the display protocol and running it as a separate communication peer-to-peer between the sender and receiver. So this actually works pretty well now. One very important thing about voice and video in the context of VDI and terminal server, your endpoint becomes critically important in this use case. For those people that use zero clients today, zero clients will cause you a lot of challenges around unified communications because most of the zero client solutions out there can't handle that side channel communication for the peer-to-peer voice and video. So zero client people, beware, this might be a sticking point for your project. Data connectivity, and unfortunately all this data is US-based because that's the only market that I work in right now, but that's the data I've collected. So in 2008, 65% of US households that had a computer had broadband internet access. And in 2008, our mobile networks were only third generation, and we only had 28.4% of people on those third generation mobile networks. So the networks were just quite a bit slower back then. And most importantly, the display protocols, meaning HDX, RDP, Remote FX, and PC over IP, were not very good running over a mobile network. Even today, the latency on a 3G network makes the modern routing protocols not that great. But 2014, US broadband is now at a 90% penetration in families that have a computer at home. So 90% of us have broadband access of some form, cable, DSL, whatever the case may be. And in 2012, there's 139 million US subscribers that have HSPA LTE 4G of some type. Could be LTE, could just be regular 4G. So this is roughly 44% of the American population has a fourth generation network. Now you guys, I know, in the Nordic area have far better broadband and mobile networks than we do, but we're getting there. 4G networks are several times faster than 3G, first of all. That's important. Most important, the latency on a 4G network is about 1/10 to 1/2 that of 3G. Latency is one of the most important things you have to worry about with the display protocol, so it's critical that our mobile networks can actually deliver VDI or terminal services to an acceptable level over mobile networks. And display protocols today work very well over 4G networks as long as your latency is somewhat static. If you're trying to travel 80 kilometers an hour and use it, that might be questionable, but generally speaking, it works pretty well. Fifth generation networks are going to make this even better. With fifth generation networks, we're going to have in the orders of hundreds of megabits available to us at a very low latency. And so using VDI or terminal services anywhere in the country or world is going to be a completely different experience than it is today. So I'll talk really quickly about storage. You guys have probably had a bazillion sessions on storage, so I'm not going to bore you with all the details here, but virtual desktops take a lot of IOPS. Those people that have been down VDI projects know, and might know from failures of your own projects, that if you don't get this right, your project will fail. So it takes a lot of IOPS. Calculating storage requirements for VDI on average IOPS is a recipe for failure. You need to be focused on the peak IOPS that are going to occur when multiple people are doing things at the same time. And this is not just boot storms. This is everyone at the same time watching the same corporate earnings broadcast video or something like that. You got to be prepared for things like that. During a boot storm, you're going to have about 90% read, about 10% write activity. And during steady state, you'll be at about 10 to 20% read and about 80 to 90% write, which means when you talk to your SAN vendors, make sure you're finding out how they handle reads versus writes, because they're very different in VDI than they are for most workloads, and make sure that they are quoting numbers that are quoting random I/O rather than sequential I/O. Most SAN vendors will quote data on things like SQL or something like that, where you've got a high volume of sequential data, but it's not random and it's not fully write activity. A lot of it's read activity. Read caching solutions can help you with your boot storms, but most of them don't address your write I/O. So think about this when you talk to your traditional SAN vendors. Many of them, even when they have deduplication, they don't do their deduplication in line. They're doing it as a post-write cron job type thing. So all your write I/O hits the SAN, and then behind the scenes, a job runs and realigns the pointers to save you your storage space. You want to make sure your data access latencies are below 15 to 20 milliseconds. This is in a traditional spinning disk model. If you're in an SSD-based solution or RAM caching, you should be well below that number, ideally between 0 and 5 milliseconds. But if your data store access latencies exceed 15 to 20 milliseconds, you are going to have complaints about performance. So it's critical that your latencies are very, very low. One way to resolve your IOPS and latency issues is through the use of SSDs. There's obviously tons of other ways to do it. Most important thing, 2014, storage should no longer be an excuse why you can't do VDI. The storage problems are fixed. There's got to be at least 10 vendors here that you can talk to solve your VDI storage problem. So don't let that be the barrier to why you do things. The last one is license complexity in VDI. So in 2007, 2008, we had this thing called VECD. And you could not run Windows virtualized in a data center unless you had VECD. It didn't matter whether it was a thin client or a full PC that you were running. This was an add-on license regardless. Good news is that's gone, but unfortunately in 2014, things aren't much better. You have two options to do VDI. You can license SA on top of a full Windows PC, and you get extended roaming rights where you can use it on VDI at the same time. This is about $50 per device per year. The problem is you're still managing a Windows device at the endpoint. Most people want to get out of the business of managing Windows devices at the endpoint. They want to do a thin client or zero client or something like that. If you do a thin client or a zero client, then you have to buy VDA licensing, which is $100 per device per year. Now, Microsoft just changed that. They just revised their SA VDA licensing so that they now allow per user-based licensing models. So I encourage you, if you haven't taken notice of this, it happened about a week or two ago. Microsoft just released a new model for Windows 8.1 licensing that now supports per user-based licensing. So this is going to change the economics of how VDI is done. So 4 out of 5 things that are better in 2014 is not so bad. This one still, unfortunately, is kind of expensive. So what's on the horizon? What things are coming up that are interesting to me? And again, this is not an admission of what things VMware is going to spend money on or where we're going to invest from a product perspective. These are just things that I see happening in the industry that are of interest to me that we'll see where this shakes out. So number one is fixing Windows desktop management. Windows desktop management is something that has fundamentally not changed in the last 30 years that we've been maintaining PCs. Whether it was LANdesk or Altiris or System Center or you name it solution, we have built and maintained Windows desktops and apps the exact same way for the last 30 years. That has to change in order to change the cost model around VDI and terminal services, not from a CapEx perspective, but from an OpEx perspective. Operationally, how we do this has to get better. Now, VMware made an acquisition a couple of months back of a company named Cloud Volumes. That acquisition is one of the key reasons that actually motivated me to join VMware. Because for as long as I've been involved in the Citrix community, they have never really moved to take on Microsoft in the PCLM world. They're too afraid of their close relationship with Microsoft to actually challenge the System Center market. And VMware is like, hey, we already hate each other, so why not? We'll go for it. And I say that tongue-in-cheek. VMware and Microsoft have a very close relationship, but it's co-opetition, I suppose. So App Volumes has the capability to revolutionize how Windows desktops and application delivery takes place. And I don't have time to discuss all the deep details, but feel free to connect with me offline and we can talk about what App Volumes does that makes things truly different in desktop management. The next thing that I think is going to happen in the next few years is a number of vendors are working on Windows application transformation engines. What I mean by this is for the last 20 to 30 years, we've been able to deliver Windows apps and desktops to any device using display remoting technologies. But we also know that pixel pushing is not necessarily the best thing you always want to be able to do. It would be much better if I had a way of reformatting that app to be more kind and friendly in a mobile device world. Now, if I rewrite the app, that's great, but that's going to cost me 18 months of time and millions of dollars. What if I don't want to do that, but I want to do something kind of in between a rewrite and running it native through a display protocol? The answer is Windows Application Transformation Engines. There are a number of different companies in this space. Citrix has done a little bit with their mobile SDK to try to make things a little bit better, but still pixel pushing majority of it. Citrix acquired a company named FrameHawk that was working on this kind of transformation engine through an SDK. There's another competitor to what FrameHawk was doing back in the day named Calgary Scientific that is doing something very similar with an SDK. And there's a new company that came out of stealth mode about 2 months ago named Redo Mobility that is also creating a transformation engine to allow you to transfer Windows apps that are natively running on top of Windows into a more mobile-friendly world. So I think this is going to be big in the industry over the years. Transitions to public cloud. And I'm not going to get into a religious debate about private cloud versus public cloud. There's no doubt in my mind that public cloud will win in the end. There's going to be a number of industries that are highly regulated that will still do private cloud for now. But there's a huge amount of investments. You know, I don't like to quote Gartner because they're often wrong, but Gartner has a prediction that by 2016, the bulk of IT spend will be on cloud. Think about that for a minute. If you guys are traditional data center architects, what are you going to do in the next year or two if that really does happen? Are you going to be cloud architects, or are you going to be the people left behind as traditional data center engineer? I mean, Joe talked about this a lot earlier, but we really have to think about how to deal with software-defined data center and public cloud. Information security. This is one of the industries that is already exploding at a ridiculous rate of investment. I think in 2015, the expected spend is about $77 billion. And every single day that another JP Morgan Chase, Home Depot, you name it, company gets breached, that investment goes up even higher. So this will easily be over $100 billion in the next probably 3 to 5 years. So this is a very interesting industry from my perspective to be investing information and money and time and effort into. And then data management. You know, data is growing at an alarming rate, and we don't have a good set of tools for actually controlling what happens with our data today. So I don't just mean your documents and whether you're using Dropbox or Box or something like that. That's one aspect of it. But we're growing data so rapidly right now, we have no way of actually understanding where it all is, who has control of it, what's encrypted, what's not encrypted, all those types of things. So the data management piece too, by the way, is very closely coupled with the public cloud investments and very closely coupled with information security. All of these things have to be interrelated to make sure we're covering things well. And then the last trend that's going to be very interesting is the Internet of Things. Now, Internet of Things, to most people in this room, you're probably like, who cares about somebody's thermostat at home and what impact that has on the global Internet? But let me put things into perspective. Today, we have 8 billion people on the planet. We have probably a couple billion devices connected to the Internet. By 2020, estimates are that we're going to have 26 billion devices on the Internet. What does that mean to the size of the Internet? What does that mean to the amount of data being generated and analyzed and computed? It means that what we do today is going to look like kindergarten compared to what it will be in 2020. So these are the things that I think are interesting. Now, again, I can't talk about what things I'm personally going to be investing in over time or what things I think VMware's going to be investing over time. But these are the things that I think everyone in this room should be thinking about how we transform our careers to take advantage of these things, because it's happening right before our eyes. And if you don't find ways of embracing these technologies, you're going to be left behind. So with that, thank you for your time. Feel free to reach out to me via email or Twitter if you have any questions. Thank you so much for letting me present here.